Hello, everyone. We are so glad that you're here to join us for ESPO's spring webinar, Addressing Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging in Grant Writing. This webinar is supported by the Gerontological Society of America's Innovation Fund. I'm your host, Dr. Lauren Starr. As a postdoctoral fellow in palliative and end-of-life care who researches racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic differences in end-of-life care and caregiving, I am so excited to hear from our esteemed panelists today about such a timely and relevant topic. So improving and expanding DEI&B research efforts are among the highest priorities for NIH agencies and private funders. Enabling diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging are critical to honoring the dignity of all people and to advancing discovery and innovation. In our session today, we will specifically explore DEI&B in grant writing. We'll start off with introductions by our panelists. Then I will moderate a discussion with questions. And along the way, I will work in your questions from the audience. So if you have questions, we will specifically, please ask those questions using that Q&A feature in Zoom, and don't use the chat box. So we're gonna be checking the Q&A feature. Alrighty, okay, so introductions. We have an incredible panel of experts here with us today. Each panelist, I'm going to invite each of you to give a 1 to 2 minute introduction of yourselves, including why your expertise is relevant for today's discussion. We have Dr. Cerise Elliott, Dr. Victoria Bahar-Zusman, Dr. Nicole Keith, and Dr. Keith Whitfield here today with us. Let's see, Dr. Elliott, will you please start us off?
Hello, I am Cerise Elliott. I am a program officer at the National Institute on Aging in the Division of Neuroscience, and my primary duty is to manage the Alzheimer's disease research centers. We currently have 37 center types across the nation. I also have an interest in health disparities for Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease related dementia. And I used to manage the portfolio on health disparities in AD. And I still find that as a primary interest of mine in my portfolio. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. Next, we have Dr. Victoria Bahar-Zusman.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Vicki Bahar-Zusman. I am an Associate Dean for Research at the University of Miami School of Nursing and Health Studies. And I have been leading for the past 15 years now a Center of Excellence that's funded by the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities that's focused on Latino populations. It's called the Center for Latino Health Research Opportunities, and it's focused on people living with HIV, people experiencing mental health problems, substance use, and intimate partner violence. So we look at these conditions together as a syndemic and look at addressing sort of multi-level interventions to either prevent or to mitigate these conditions. I'm also the developmental lead for the Center on Mental Health and HIV. It's an NIMH funded P30 center. And the focus of the core that I lead is investigator development.
Excellent, thank you. Now on to Dr. Nicole Keith.
Thanks, Lauren. I do want to ask, everything just got very blurry on my screen, so I want to make sure my video and audio are fine.
Yes, your video and audio are fine.
Okay, perfect. Not for me, but as long as it is for you, it's okay. I'm Nicole Keith, and I am a professor of kinesiology and the Associate Dean of Faculty Affairs in the School of Health and Human Sciences at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. I am also the immediate past president of the American College of Sports Medicine, and I'm the first underrepresented minority to serve in that position. I am a research scientist at Regenstrief Institute, and also a scientist in the IU Center for Aging Research in the School of Medicine. Our work focuses on Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, and research related to that. I'm really proud to say that we have the leading investigators in the world doing this work, and that we are utilizing health informatics and electronic health records to connect patient information through both clinical programs and through research. And so I've been doing this work for the last 20 years. And part of my service also involves serving on a panel for the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute for K Awards. So I'm really excited about this conversation and how we can help our colleagues become more successful in research.
Excellent, thank you. Now on to President Whitfield.
Good morning, good afternoon, depends on where you are. It's morning here in lovely Las Vegas. I'm Keith Whitfield. I am a professor of psychology, a professor of brain health, and I'm also the president of UNLV. I'm the first African-American president here. And in addition to being a president, I'm still an active researcher. I have a research grant now from the National Institute on Aging that's on looking at stress and longevity in African-American families. My research has spanned a while and tends to be focused on cognition, health, and aging. And then lastly, I'd say I also serve as a member of the NACA, which is the National Advisory Council on Aging for the National Institute on Aging. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you all. Wow, we have such a great group today. So I am personally very excited to hear what you guys are going to say. So I know that all of the participants we have on the call are also very grateful that you're here with us today. So thank you for sharing your time with us. We're going to jump into questions now. We're going to start off broad with, kind of the big picture questions of research, and then move into the process of grant writing. Sometimes I'll direct a question to a specific panelist, but in general, everyone will have the opportunity to jump in and share their thoughts if they so choose. All right, so here we go. All right, Dr. Elliott, let's start the first question off with you. To ensure a common understanding during this webinar, how might we operationalize the concept of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in grant writing? Like, is there a consensus-driven definition that you feel is best to use?
In writing NIH grants, there is our interest in diversity statement that gives a baseline understanding of diversity. But how we operationalize the concept of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, is not a simple feat. There are 4 separate actions that need their own kind of operation. And for diversity, in general, we talk about having a workforce or a participant group of diverse backgrounds and of different life experiences. And we hope that this diverse background and these life experiences bring a different perspective and creativity and individual enterprise to an organization. In equity, I think we discuss equity, we're talking about opportunities and understanding that these opportunities are not equally available to all, and that certain steps need to be managed to make sure that these opportunities are available to all. With inclusion, the inclusion points to the systems that we are operating in which prevents people from participating in the opportunities that we have. And so it requires us to build an evaluation process of understanding these systems and evaluating the efforts that we're doing. And in belonging, I feel like that's a new term for me. Belonging requires a two-way street of communication in which, the diverse individuals, have an open understanding, or they can communicate what their needs are in order to bring different perspectives and creativity and their individual enterprise to the organization. And the organization needs to be committed in having open opportunities for people to belong and participate into the organization.
That's very, very helpful. Thank you. Does anyone else want to jump in and share their thoughts on operationalizing the concept?
It was a really comprehensive answer. So thank you, Dr. Elliott. I just think what's missing from this slide potentially is social justice. And so I cannot add to her response because it was so comprehensive, but I would recommend that as we're considering diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, that we also think about this concept of social justice and how important it is as researchers that we're incorporating these groups that have been systematically excluded from research, either by their own choice or by the system, and that they're included as well, because we cannot arrive at social justice unless we're including these individuals.
Yeah, that is absolutely so important. And on that same subject, given that many older adults have been historically excluded from research and do experience discrimination based on age, how might we consider and talk about age in the context of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and social justice? Dr. Whitfield, do you want to take a stab at that first?
Yeah, only if you try to repeat the question.
Sure. Oh, sorry. Let's move on. Yeah, there it is. There we go. So given that many adults have historically been excluded and also experience discrimination based on age, when we're thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging and social justice, how should we also be thinking about age?
Well, this is a fascinating question because I think it's very multifaceted. One of the overarching concepts is that, as gerontologists, we actually also have to be historians, because we have to think about how those individuals have moved across the life course and the kinds of things, events that have happened both nationally and locally that may impact their desire to participate, their trust in any kind of, call it the medical field, but I think anybody who asks a question gets put under that same kind of perspective. But I think the belongingness piece is, I think the piece of that that's very interesting. I appreciated Dr. Elliott's comments on that. I think the only thing I'd suggest too is that we need to add the idea of figuring out how we actually share our information with those folks that we get information from, so that they can feel like they have a sense of belonging in the process of generating knowledge about a people, a group that they actually belong with. The piece about experiencing discrimination ends up being very interesting and fascinating too, when you think about efforts to do recruitment, and that they have to be sensitive and they have to be informed about the kind of discrimination that goes on currently and also historically, to be able to effectively actually recruit those groups. But then again, I come back to the information, the point about trying to share information with them, so that discrimination is a traumatizing event. And one of the ways in which we can ultimately kind of reach this goal of trying to have diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then that belonging piece, is to make sure that we bring closer to that knowledge generation these affected populations.
Excellent. Does anyone else want to add to that? Specifically in that context of age?
I guess that, I really love that answer, and I love the idea of that researchers have to be historians also. And one of the things I guess I think about when we talk about aging research, research with people who are older adults, is intersectionality, right? Because you have discriminations that are, or stigmas or historical issues that have to do with people's ethnic or cultural background, but then that also intersects with all of the kinds of discrimination and ageist sorts of attitudes that come with aging. And that looks different for people from different groups. And so to really be able to think about how these identities intersect with each other, I think is important.
Now, in that same vein, we have a question. How would we see disability and accessibility in this framework, particularly in the context of, say, mental health?
I was thinking about the last two presenters' answers, and thinking about ageists and ageism, and about this expectation of aging, and that older adults, it's one of the few categories where people self-identify and even self-discriminate. And so it's really important also to think about, consider as a provider or as a researcher, that we consider people's experiences. And in terms of disability, how that disability helps them interact with their environment, how it helps them to contribute to their community, and not to make assumptions about aging, even if the older adult themselves have assumptions about aging and some of the disability that is accompanied by aging. It still shouldn't affect their ability to contribute either cognitively or physically within their community, and that we cannot make sweeping generalizations about people who are members of this community of older adults.
Great, thank you. So now this next question is for everyone. Again, thinking kind of big picture. Can you each tell us about a recent grant that you wrote or reviewed that effectively incorporated diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and social justice?
I think I'll take it first. I think that when we have a focus for grant applications to come in to incorporate these characteristics, I think that it's important for an investigator to really hone in on what the research question is, because the specificity of what that research question is dependent on who, is going to be included into your research. So the idea that you have to include everyone may be a little much for early career investigators, but if you have a specific question that is related to a specific underrepresented group, I think that that idea of examining the diverse background of the participants that you're selecting in your study and those particular life experiences, especially in aging research and trying to understand the whole life course of an individual and what that research question is, that becomes the most important thing that you need to understand is what you're actually trying to research and what participants you actually need.
And let me try to pile on to what Dr. Elliott just said, which I think is for our audiences the most important piece, which is that if you don't start off with the right question, adding diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, actually, it starts to make it blurrier, not clearer. And so the first thing is having that very solid, very well-grounded scientific perspective, scientific question that you're asking, and then go from there. And then diversity, equity, and inclusion end up being very important pieces to be able to I think, cultivate, think about, include, make, unique, based on what that question is. When you were talking, Dr. Elliott, I was really thinking about the research that I've done over the years. And for the most part, it's all been within group. And there's lots of folks sometimes that want to do within group research, but they don't start off with a question that is designed to study within group. They ask questions that are designed for between group. Like, well, so why, if, is there ethnic diversity in cognitive functioning? And then they say, oh, I only want to study Hispanics. The problem is that you've set up the question of that it should be a between group rather than a within group. And that I have found over the years that is the most important aspect, is the starting point of how that question is actually framed, and then going from there. And you have to basically think about what it is that you're actually trying to get at, and make sure that first that question asks the question correctly, and then you can layer on the unique features that diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging actually would bring to it if you get that study done.
Yeah, and if I could sort of build from there, I really like that direction and that clarity, is sort of applying that same idea to intervention development and cultural tailoring of interventions, which people will write about. They'll say, well, there's this intervention out there that works, but it hasn't been used with X population, with Hispanics, with African Americans, whoever it is. And, there really has to be a very, very clear rationale and showing of understanding, first of all, of how does this clinical problem look different in this particular group, and on what basis are you making your adaptation, so that there's a clear match between the kinds of things that you're saying are, sort of unique features of this population as it pertains to this particular problem, and which could be protective factors, risk factors, strengths, preferences, all kinds of things. And how are you directly addressing those things in this adapted intervention? And I think it's really important to be very clear about that.
And I would just add, these are all excellent points to consider the social determinants of health. I happen to live in a community that's pretty homogeneous in terms of education, income, and resources. And yet, based on this question that you have up, Lauren, I've been doing this work for over 20 years and trying to figure out how the social determinants of health are impacting health outcomes. In our research, we've discovered and are supported by other researchers that, for example, in weight loss interventions, Black women lose 50% less weight than white women, given similar resources. And so when we talk about like recent grants that we've wrote or implemented, we're looking at microenvironments, because the macro environment, the neighborhood in which they live, the built environment in which they have access to sidewalks or bike lanes or active transportation or healthy food, that's all the same. And so really thinking about what else is it about their heritage, about their culture, about their microenvironment, what's in their home, what are they exposed to at work, or the community in which they worship, or where they go to school, that is changing their behavior. And so really looking at the social determinants of health as you write these proposals, and then in being inclusive with diversity, equity, and social justice, because it goes probably beyond individual behavior, and we really want to look at environmental and policies.
Great. So following up, Dr. Keith, on those social determinants of health, we hear about them so much. Universities are making a push to really define them better and standardize them in their research within schools and with other, across interventions. How have you incorporated social determinants of health in your grant writing? And that question applies to everyone else as well.
So that's all I do. And so how I incorporate it in a variety of ways. So I make sure, first of all, I do community-based participatory research. And so first of all, I'm making sure that I'm talking to community members, community residents, and also leaders to understand what their needs are and how my research might be consistent with their needs. And even if there are inconsistencies, I feel like it's my responsibility to connect community members with potentially other researchers that are going to meet their needs. It's imperative that whatever we're doing, that we're making sure that we're being inclusive from the conception to the dissemination, that community members are included in the integration of our research to their community. I am very proud to say that I've been doing this for 20 years, and I can go back to the same communities because they trust me. They know that I'm respectful of their traditions, of their community members, whether they're kids, and I know this is aging, but I really, watch people age, and my aging research really starts at kind of 36 years old. And so these people I've been engaged with them for a long time. And it's really important to continue engagement, to continue communication. And I don't know if we're going to get to it, so I'm just going to say it right now, is to make sure that your research team is reflective of the community. Because if it isn't, they can't see themselves in your research. And it's really important that that happens.
Yeah, that is, I see some clapping hands. A lot of people agree with that. So thank you for sharing that. Before we move on to another audience question, does anyone else want to share about a recent grant that they developed? Okay. Oh, Dr. Beher-Zuzman?
No, I was just going to say that the grants I've been working on for the last 10 years or so are predominantly infrastructure grants, center grants. And so I guess addressing DEI sort of happens at two levels, and they're grants focused on disparities. So it's sort of like the first level is focusing on what are the resources that you need to build into your research environment that can adequately help to address disparities. And Dr. Keith's mention of community engagement, I think, is absolutely key. And that's an area where we could really assist, especially young investigators, in sort of developing those relationships by having good infrastructure. And then the other level has to do with participation and the advancement of underrepresented minority investigators. And so just like with your clinical populations or your research populations, it's, what are their specific needs? What are the disparities that they experience? How do you address that through, at the background level, the background significance? So what are the disparities, and why do you need, what is the rationale for needing, special attention? At the approach level, it's, what are the programs that you're going to provide that will help people to advance, that will address some of the barriers that they face, and showing that your investigator team, your mentors or whoever they are, that they are well equipped, showing your successes. So it's, you sort of approach the infrastructure piece the same way you would approach a research project.
Excellent, thank you. So as important as what's done well is knowing those common mistakes to avoid. This question's for everyone, but I'm going to keep up with you, Dr. Beher-Zuzman. From the perspective of a grant reviewer or a grant writer, what are some common examples of DEI&B done poorly, or common mistakes that you've seen made when addressing it?
So, I mean, I think, different people on the panel have really made some excellent points. I think one part of the grant or one section of the grant that people tend to not think about as much. So, we really focus on our specific aims and our research strategy. And then we sort of forget about all that back end stuff, that we do at the last minute. And I think that's where you really face some problems. And there's two sections in particular One is human subjects. And Dr. Keith talked about social justice. Well, justice is one of the Belmont principles, right? And people forget to address some of these issues in their human subjects section. And the other section is inclusion of women and minorities. And people have a tendency to just, rattle off a couple of sentences. And, because, they're on a deadline and they've really paid attention to these, maybe they've paid really nice attention to these things in their research strategy, but then they forget to really attend to them in the inclusion section. And I see that, review committees really pay attention. You're saying you're gonna recruit, a particular population. How are you doing it? And what is your approach? And if you're going to be recruiting a group of people who are traditionally underrepresented, and maybe you're in a community that doesn't have a huge number of people in this population, you really have to demonstrate that you've thought this through and that you can do it, or else you get dinged. It's not a scoring criteria, but you can get dinged on the review for these sort of omissions.
And I think something that I've experienced throughout my career at NIH is I think that we've made a commitment to support recruitment and retention, and there's still hesitancy to actually submit a budget that supports the individuals and the infrastructure necessary to recruit underrepresented or minoritized individuals into studies. And that is an allowable budget item. You're allowed to budget for it. And I think that it's definitely a mistake if you don't make your budget reflective of what you need to do in order to be successful.
Writing down some of these very important points.
I'm just going to add, because as a grant reviewer, we're always told not to discuss the F word. And we joke about it, the funding. And so that's the F word. Like, we're supposed to focus on the science. But as I was listening to Dr. Bahar's, I was like thinking, we're human reviewers. And so we're looking at the whole thing, and we're trying not to focus on the funding, but we're focusing on the funding because these are, for NIH, these are taxpayer dollars, and we want to be responsible with taxpayer dollars. These are my dollars and your dollars. And we want to make sure that the science is sound. But for those of us who are really focused on social justice and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, we also want to make sure it's inclusive. And so in terms of training, we also want to think about that. We want to think about, what are you going to learn from this? Who are you going to be when you're done? And how are you going to improve science, medicine, and the community when this research is over? And we're human. And so we are reading about this and thinking about what we care about, what is happening in our world today, and how what we support is going to improve not only our world, but the world for people who are growing older, so that they can be healthy and aging appropriately. And so it's really important to think about this. And I also thought about, like, what is it? So if you live in a place that's not really that diverse in terms of maybe age or race or gender, but you're like, what else? Like, can you impact prisoners? Can you impact people with disabilities? So what else can you do in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion? Is there a large veteran population in your community? This counts. And so what else besides, what we had traditionally thought about in terms of race? Age is important, and what else is important? And so I do really love this conversation about intersectionality, because there are other factors that make us a diverse community.
Excellent. Dr. Whitfield, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, perhaps the only thing that I would add to that is that, thinking about the pieces of a grant from a grant reviewer's perspective that you look for as critical elements. And one of them is expertise, is experience, being able to demonstrate that, being able to demonstrate institutional both capacity and commitment. And I think that DEI, the sorts of things go to that and can be highlighted. It's so funny because there's just not enough room in grants these days. Back in the day when I was a young man, you had 25 pages to be able to write a grant. You just don't have as much time. So you've got to make highly impactful, highly significant sorts of statements about, one, your experience, two, your capability and the capacity to be able to do the kind of work that you're thinking about doing. And one of the other things, I guess we may talk about it later, is that you really have to think about where the grant is going as well, because the kind of assignment that it gets in terms of the review committee is very important. And even if it's a first submission versus a second submission, there's certain things that you'll learn about what they're looking for in these kinds of statements that's critically important and has to be responded to.
Great, thank you. So now let's move into some of the nuts and bolts of grant writing. We've touched a little on social determinants of health, which kind of builds into frameworks. So I want to talk about frameworks. What are some examples of theoretical frameworks you have used to guide your incorporation of DEI&B and social justice in grant writing? This is an open question for anyone who wants to jump in.
This is a super difficult question for me because the theoretical frameworks that I utilize, really, I don't think about diversity, equity, inclusion when I am using the theoretical frameworks, but I should. And so I looked at this question and I'm like, uh-oh, I'm not doing that. I think of them as separate entities, and they should be combined. They should be integrated. And I hope that just by the nature of my research, I'm doing this, but I don't know that you can select a particular theoretical framework. So my most recent work has to do with a theory that many people are like, I've never heard of that before, but I think about the theory of automaticity, because in behavior, we're asking people to exercise specific behaviors that might be unnatural to them. So if I say to you, I want you to incorporate physical activity into your everyday life because I'm a kinesiologist, that's what I want, that's really hard. But in the theory of automaticity, if I charge you $120 to park your car close to where you work, but only $5 if you park your car a half a mile, so you have to walk, that's part of the theory of automaticity. Part of it is also about what can I do to make the healthy choice the easy choice. And then I think about, okay, so what does that have to do with DEI&B? And I think that we need to make the healthy choice the easy choice in every community, regardless of their resources, regardless of crime statistics or safety or the built environment, and whether there are traffic calming measures. And these are issues that are related to physical activity, but also, we think about how people can get around, how people can engage in the community. And we look at things like, how long does it take the light to turn? And how long it takes somebody to cross that street. And it's really a challenge. Or we think about offering instructions to people who have cognitive impairment, and how many different instructions can they do on an everyday basis. And so these are the challenges that we're facing, but these are the theories that we're thinking about. And so it's just really funny, and I'd like to hear what the other co-panelists think about this question, because when I'm thinking about theoretical frameworks, I'm not often thinking about, like, how old is the person? What is their race? Where do they live? They're separate, and I was not trained to incorporate them. And so I would like to hear how other people are doing that.
Let me see if I can take a stab at that. There's some work by Anna Recause, which really speaks to, I guess it's an issue that I deal with because I write grants that only have African Americans in them. But it talks about the different kinds of assumptions that go into when you're doing between group research work, and ones that have to be mindful. It's an old paper. The better paper to maybe look at is one that was written by me in 2008 in the Journal of Gerontology, which sets up some of the frameworks. It ties and cites a number of theoretical frameworks about how you appropriately do between group research to try to get at the idea of appreciating diversity, thinking about ways in which things are not equitable. We always talk about kind of E, maybe it should be IE, that it's the inequality a lot of times that our research actually is attempting to shine a light on. That's one way. There was also some work by Norm Anderson, and I'm horrible today because I don't remember exact citations, but he was talking about different ways and different levels of analyses that you might take a look at when you're looking at DEI&B sorts of concepts. And, you know, some of it is very basic, some of it becomes very much more complicated. I think it speaks to Dr. Keith's point about microenvironments and how you might try to dissect or figure out the intersections that those may have with the phenomena that you're studying. So that's my suggestion.
Yeah, sort of building on Dr. Whitfield's comments. You know, the NIMHD has a health disparities framework, which is basically shaped like a grid, and it has on the horizontal axis, it's multiple levels of influence of different kinds of health conditions. You know, so there's the individual level, the interpersonal, community, societal, and then on the vertical axis, it has the domains of influence. You know, they could be biological, behavioral, the built environment, sociocultural, healthcare systems. And given that a lot of issues having to do with disparities have these multi-level, you know, influences, it's a very useful, you know, it's a little bit overwhelming. So, you know, don't feel like, you should never feel like you have to address things at all of these levels or at all, you know, hit a lot of different boxes, but it is a really useful way of organizing, sort of thinking about how to address a specific, you know, kind of disparity. And so I find that very useful. The other framework I mentioned earlier that we use a lot at our centers is the Syndemic Framework. And that originated around the SAVA syndemic, which is substance abuse, violence, and substance abuse, violence, and HIV/AIDS. And the idea being that these health conditions tend to happen together and they have a synergistic effect on each other, but they also have sort of common roots, common social determinants. And I think that, you know, the Syndemic Framework can be thought about for, you know, different kinds of health conditions besides the SAVA ones. And I find that to be useful. And it was developed around minority communities because it really wanted to incorporate what was happening in the environment at the environmental level that had such a strong impact on multiple health conditions, not just one particular health condition.
Well, that was great. I know that theoretical frameworks can be kind of a hard, a difficult topic, and I know that was probably really practical advice. And Dr. Whitfield, you're probably going to see a bunch more downloads and citations coming your way. So, still in that nuts and bolts kind of stage, let's talk a little bit about recruitment and sampling. Dr. Keith, let's start with you on this one. You and Dr. Whitfield, I know, do a lot of community-based research, but this question is open to everyone. What type of recruitment and sampling strategies are optimal for addressing diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and social justice in grant writing?
So we have, prior to the pandemic, everything was in person. And then during the pandemic, we've been doing other types of recruitment that are more virtual. And I would have told you 3 years ago that would never work, that you have to be there and you have to make a connection with your potential research participants. And that's not true. And I think it's not true because lots of people are more comfortable, and especially older adults are more comfortable at home and are more comfortable like within their community than going outside of the community. I think that it's really important to communicate the message for diversity, equity, and inclusion to communicate the message that most research participants are men and they're white. And that we make our medical decisions and our scientific decisions based on research. And if all we have are data from white men, that's how we're going to make our decisions. And so, you know, regardless of what happened with Tuskegee and what happened with the HeLa cells, and that we're really aware of it, but we are required to have an institutional review, and that we are monitored by a scientific board to make sure we're not taking advantage of you. But if you don't participate in our research, our decisions are going to be made on people who are not like you. And we communicate this all the time, every time, that we want you to participate in our research because we want to make decisions based on data from everyone and not just based on people who trust science and medicine. We've got to get you to trust science and medicine so that we can make our decisions based on you. And this communication seems to resonate with people, but it has to be said in an authentic way, in a way that you really mean it. And so as a researcher, you have to believe it. You have to mean it. You have to say, I am going to protect you. I'm going to protect your family. I'm going to protect your current family and your future family. And even if I mess up, there's a whole group of people who are going to make sure I follow the rules and who are watching me that I have to report to, just to help people trust we're doing the best for them. It's just such a challenge in the current society that underrepresented minorities, people from underrepresented groups in general, don't trust science and medicine. And we've got to help them trust us and mean it and really believe in them and have them believe in us.
Yeah, that was great. Dr. Whitfield, in your experience, what have you found with recruitment and sampling?
Well, I think to the point that Dr. Keith just mentioned, the pandemic has thrown a monkey wrench in things. I think it was difficult before when you would go out and recruit folks and you could at least be in the community and people could see you, and there's things that could actually benefit your strategies. Just if you're hiring the right people, which I think was mentioned earlier, I think it's an important point. It's become extremely difficult now. And so as you're writing that grant and talking about recruitment and sampling strategies, I'm hoping that we can go back to what we had back in 19 or early 20s, which is these different ways in which we can actually make sure that we're making contact with those populations that we touch and that we know, and using things to make sure that those folks feel like they are going to be protected, that their information is going to be kept confidential, that that there's somebody that is writing from their perspective. I think that's a lot of what I hear from some of our older folks. In the studies that I have, we always have African-American folks who do the interviews, and that is oftentimes reported to be something that people feel much more comfortable with. Oftentimes our folks get offered plates. In the South, you oftentimes will get a wonderful meal if you come and visit someone. But we've really tried to make sure that we do as much in person as possible. That's the reason why the pandemic has caused the study we're doing on longevity so many challenges, because it's just not the same as having that in-person contact with people that have been excluded or have been taken advantage of in the past. It's just, it is much more difficult in so many different ways. And so I think in terms of writing grants, I'm hoping that we can get back to a point where it does make sense and it is a viable approach to be able to actually see people in person, because I think that it does make a difference in the kinds of populations that we're talking about. And even in dealing with the intersectionality, I think that was brought up, that it's a very important point, and one that does have an impact on recruitment.
And just as a follow-up to that, in context of the pandemic, Dr. Elliott, from a reviewing standpoint, what have you seen, post-COVID? What is working the best from this recruitment sampling post-COVID for DEI&B?
I think that, we have, as an institution or agency, really been realistic about the state of the pandemic and the state of research. And so the instructions for reviewers is to, not consider the pandemic in the review of the application. And so that's like the standard policy right now. And that's our goal is, barring, an improvement, that what is being presented in your recruitment and sampling strategies are addressing the diversity, equity and inclusion and belonging, and that those required sections are being considered, and that that you're presenting a strong project on those strategies.
Now we have a question from the audience that's a specific point within this recruitment and sampling. How do you budget to include underrepresented populations when an institution doesn't understand or believe or value compensating these populations appropriately? What are some strategies for making the case for greater compensation?
I think that this person's question kind of, leans into the diversity, equity, and inclusion policies of their institution. And I think there needs to be a consideration of how compensation is not a new or unique strategy for recruitment. And if the institution doesn't have an open mind to the idea of reimbursement or compensation for participant recruitment, I think that the overall commitment to diversity, inclusion, and equity should be considered.
Dr. Elliott, I love that answer. But I was thinking, so I've been here for a long time, and this was not popular when I arrived, but it's what I wanted to do. And so we did things like we would put in the budget transportation. I am in an urban institution in the middle of the city. People can't get here. It's hard for people who work here and learn here to be here because of transportation. And so we would put transportation in our budget. It seems very reasonable. We would put childcare in our budget. Seems very reasonable. Same with senior care in our budget. Seems very reasonable. We're not talking about DEI&B at all. We're just talking about how do we get people here, because this is a very difficult, we're in an urban institution. There are 7 hospitals on our campus. It's expensive to get here, and to expect people to get care and participate in research, we've got to make accommodations for everyone. When our students and our faculty are saying it's hard to get here, of course, research participants are going to have a difficult time getting here. And so we don't talk about being impoverished or having low education. We talk about access. And that is a way to get around if your university isn't really interested in DEI. A way to get around it is just talking about access and how difficult it is for people who have lots of resources to have access. Let's make it easy for people who don't have the education or income resources to still get access to our institution. And everybody wants that. We want people to come to our campus. Otherwise, we're not going to have a publicly supported institution. Like, we have to do this. We have a responsibility to the public, and we have to make sure that we're accessible. And so don't talk about DEI if your institution doesn't care about it. Talk about being an accessible institution.
And I love the examples that Dr. Keith gave in her response, is because, you know, in changing the group think about a certain thing, like, you know, if giving someone cab fare or transportation is really like rubbing the wrong way, I think you have to start talking and framing access, and these are your solutions to an access, you know, limitation. And I think it takes a lot, you know, I think that's where, you know, I opened up about talking about belonging. If you belong at your institution, you should openly be able to talk about the shortcomings that you're finding in belonging at the institution. So.
Thank you. Now we are coming up on just a few more minutes. Dr. Keith, I'm going to ask this, and then I'm going to ask a final broad question about a general advice, but I'm sorry, Dr. Whitfield, I mean, you've talked a little bit before about analysis and between group analysis. What considerations are important for that analysis that truly demonstrate your focus on this, you know, important concept?
Well, we only have a few minutes, and so I can't give
Let me give you the hard one.
my usual lecture on this. I think, you know, what is so interesting is that you actually have to do what you always do, which is to show a gap in our understanding, and that research is going to actually fill that gap. And so if it is one that's targeted towards focusing on a specific group, it's the idea that, you know, you might talk a little bit about some of the between group pieces, but talk about the individual factors, the individual conditions, the individual environments, the microaggressions, all of those things that impact that group, and then create variability within that group. I think one of the things that you've heard from different pieces of what our speakers have said is that those groups in and of themselves have special unique features, that's going to be a part of how you truly write something, develop something as a grant proposal and subsequent papers that actually highlight what's different about that group, what's special about that group, what the strengths about that group are, not just about the weaknesses, which sometimes we can get into the habit or to the rut of actually doing. And so I think in that short period of time that I have, I think that's part of what the foci needs to be on, is making sure that you really set up a very good argument. You know, it's basic grant 101. You may write some stuff, but then do an outline and make sure that your rationale moves in a point that is increasing in terms of where it's getting to the point where you then say, aha, so this is why I'm doing it, because of all of these things, and it makes the rationale stronger.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, I know that we have come up on time. We have 1 minute. We're not able to get to all the audience question, although I've incorporated a number through. But one of the questions was, if you had one piece of advice to give to our, you know, early career people writing grants, what would that be in the context of DEI&B and social justice? Dr. Elliott.
My one piece of advice is what I mentioned earlier, is really understand your research question and what is it that you're trying to drill down and ask about in your research.
Okay, Dr. Keith.
Authenticity. Be authentic to your passion. It will come through in your writing.
Fantastic. Dr. Beharra Zuzman.
Well, I would say read Dr. Whitfield's paper.
More downloads. And Dr. Whitfield.
Well, I don't know if Yvonne and I can follow up on that because that was a brilliant piece of suggestion. I would say, and I want to dovetail on something that Dr. Keith said, which is that sometimes people say that it's not good to just follow your passion because sometimes it can lead you astray. That's never been the case for me. Every research grant that I've ever gotten, I was passionate about. And the reason why is that if you get a big grant, it's going to last 5 years of your life. It is not a short-term sort of investment. And so you should be passionate about it. It should be something that you think is going to have impact. But the other piece and the suggestion that I always give is make sure that it doesn't just exist in your mind. Take it out for a walk, share it with people, share it with community of scholars that you trust and that you know about what some of your thoughts are, because these things are not easy to be able to answer and even to formulate the right questions for. So before you get it reviewed by a group of folks who are not necessarily there to try to help you, they are there to try to do a job. Get it with some of your colleagues and let them have the friendly pushback and questioning and conversations, because it's going to help develop your thoughts and your ideas around the concept better.
What an awesome conversation. I know we weren't able to get to every question. We are so thankful for our panelists to be here, and I want to be respectful of their time and of your time, everyone in the audience. Up on the screen, you will see email addresses if you did have a couple specific questions. I know I have benefited greatly from hearing people's perspectives, and this just makes me more excited to actually jump back into writing and thinking, and I hope you all feel the same way. Just in terms of kind of some follow-up, you guys, everyone on the call will receive an email with a link to provide some feedback. Our goal at GSA is to provide, effective and useful and helpful webinars for you guys to improve your work and get you excited about what you do. So make sure to look for that and please fill it out. And again, just a huge round of applause and thanks to our panelists, Dr. Elliott, Dr. Keith, Dr. Behar-Zuzman, and Dr. Whitfield. We really appreciate your time. And this has just been such a great conversation.
Thank you so much. This is really enjoyable.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Bye-bye.
Have
Good
a great
luck, everyone.
Yeah, yes, good luck, right?
Right.